we don't start on time.
My mistake.
So sorry, but Anette is here. Since the beginning, it's our whole some technical issues, of course, as usual. Sorry for that. Happy to have you for a workshop, discuss how we can do business in conflict settings, whether it's pre-conflict or post-conflict or fragile conflicts like what are practicing nowadays. I'm happy also to have Anette Hoffman with us today. Anette is she's expert on this topic not only in Sudan, but she tried to do some researches to understand how your business impact or trigger or affect the conflict in many cities, not only in Sudan, but I think in Somalia. Have you worked with that? And she has a very nice research.
She's doing promotion for me.
Growing or coping. How the SMEs they cope and the conflict settings. So they grow or cope, or how they cope with the risks. So we have very few comments. So 2 years to bring us like 10 or 20. But if some of you want the copy, just speak with me after the session. I'm going to leave you with Anette, and I hope you will challenge her with your questions, with your comments. She loves challenges, and she has the voice to respond to those challenges. Thank you, Anette.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Khansa. Good midday, everyone. And thank you for coming and being on time. And the delay is totally my bad. I came late and I was rushing, so I apologize. But on the good side is there could, for me, not be a better way of spending my last days in Sudan for now than to be here at 249Startups, hosted by friends and mind-like people who also care about this topic that is so important to me, which is how to do business in contexts that are quite complex and challenging, and we've ended up calling them fragile. Myself, my name is Anette. Just like Sudan, I'm also in transition. I've been working here for the past 3.5 years with the German Development Cooperation, GIZ, in Darfur on employment promotion. And I'm now moving back to Europe with my family, and I'll be going back to my old area of research. However, the topic and also the regional focus of my work is not changing. Before I start, I want to check in with you whether English is totally fine or whether we would need some support in translating, because my Arabic is so poor, unfortunately. I apologize for that. How is it? It's okay? Yeah? And that's a good reminder to myself to also not talk too much, right? Definitely this is not a lecture. It's a topic that is still new and people are struggling with. And you have experience with implementing the task of supporting businesses or running businesses in contexts like Sudan. So I very much see this as an exchange, and I'm here to share some of the research findings over the past, decade or a little less. And then I'd be very curious also to hear your, as Khansa said, hard questions. Also if you question the whole approach, be welcome. I would only really benefit from that. And if there's anyone listening out there, also most welcome to join in online. It's a pleasure. So the topic is doing business in contexts of fragility and conflicts. And there is a difference between doing business directly, and I'd like to ask this as a question: who of you is actually in the business of running a business? And who is rather working with an institution of research or of development cooperation or a government institute that supports businesses to expand and grow? So who's running a business herself or himself? Yes, 1 here, 2. That's it? 3. Yes, okay. So welcome. You are a very important resource person for today. And then we have other people who might be dealing with how to support businesses in doing so, right? Okay. Is anyone also involved in research? doing research or studying, more generally? And who's working for a government institution? Anyone from the government, a public institution? University or, no? Okay. And I'm sure there's some of you are multitasking, are doing both, and that's why they don't fit in my questions, and that's fine. That's exactly what we're talking about today. So I brought with me 3 questions, and I'm sorry to say I will not bring the answers. My task is just to make sure we keep asking these questions, right? And the more we ask them, the better we become in seeing patterns in answers that will never be the same, right? So the first one is, what characterizes a fragile context or a context of conflict? The second one is, how do our operations, maybe my business, maybe my GIZ program, how does it interact with these conflict dynamics, fragility dynamics? And thirdly, if we see that there's strong interaction, how do I relate to those interactions? How do I steer the interactions rather than being the victim of it? All right? These are the 3 questions we'll be discussing today. Starting with the first, I brought 4 pictures and I've numbered them. And my question now to you is to start familiarizing and waking up and relating to the topic is, which of these topics for you represents fragility or conflict? You can only choose one. If you see like all of them match, Malish, you have to choose the one that you feel is really speaking mostly on the issues you feel or have experienced when it comes to fragility. 3? Who said 3? You? Yes. Great. Can you tell us why?
I choose 3 because the current...
Oh, wait. I have a microphone.
All right. I choose 3. Okay. So, I have chosen 3 regarding the current situation here in Sudan. Firstly, the inflation, the unstable, the economic. So that's why I have chosen 3. Yeah.
What is your name?
Mujahid. Mujahid Adam. Yeah.
Mujahid.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mujahid.
Yeah.
Very good. You've all heard the relation that we're seeing in this picture is inflation, volatility, right, of the financial markets. Yes. Khansa, shall we give her the floor? Or she starts talking and she might not finish.
I'm not Khansa anymore. I'm just participant in this workshop. So please, if you treat me like others. So I choose 4 because it looks like there is security issues or like war context or something. And for me, stability and security is one of the main reason of fragile context, and it affects everything. Actually, it affects economic, it affects many things. So that's why 4 is for me more relevant to.
This one, right?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we heard more aspects that relate to fragility and conflict, which are insecurity, maybe the presence of arms. Do you know where this is actually? Can you name it?
Nuba Mountain?
No, I mean, it could be. But what is the scene that we're seeing here? And it's a bit far away. Yeah. It's a mine. It's an informal mine. Artisanal mining, gold mining in Congo, this one. So that's something we have in Sudan as well, right? And many issues related to it as well. Yeah. Very good. Now, I want someone else who sees more in the other pictures, please. Do we have any volunteer? And Arabic would be fine, and we'll just bring in someone for translation. Would you say that 1 and 2 are not representing issues that we have in Sudan? Yes, please. What is your name?
Sadiq.
Sadiq.
Okay, nice to meet you. I think in the picture of the one picture, there's refugees. People are leaving their places, maybe running from wars, maybe from lacking the resources maybe food, maybe security and stability.
Great. Thank you, Sadiq. So additional points here: migration, mobility of people, food shortages, insecurity again, because people often, well, they flee mostly because they have to. No one would choose for it out of fun. Yes, very good. And also something we live in Sudan in different regions at different degree and with different, origins. But Sudan has become famous to a certain degree as a country of transit and also of origin of forced migration and displacement. All right. Maybe I'll leave it here. Later on, we might hear a bit more from people who are joining on social media, like where people see most of their connections with in these pictures. Why do we start with these pictures? Well, from your answers, what became very clear is that causes and consequences of conflict are actually the same most of the time. And it took a long time for policymakers to understand that. That's why we had a terminology of post-conflict that you might remember. A lot of the reconstruction efforts in Darfur was post-conflict, was framed as post-conflict. A lot of the reconstruction efforts in South Sudan was also called post-conflict. And, language and label maybe doesn't matter too much. However, it did to a certain extent because we fail to see often that post-conflict was always pre-conflict. And the reason is that the causes of conflict remained unaddressed most of the time. So whether it is displacement, people clearly fleeing a conflict and insecurity, so that it is a consequence of the insecurity, they're fleeing and looking for safer heavens. However, having an already scarcely resourced environment, being, welcoming additional people also poses more tensions, more conflict over resources, right? Inflation, another one. Inflation is something that can drive conflict, that can be the drop, that makes people then decide we'll go to the streets and we'll no longer accept this. And at the same time, if disorder then starts, if chaos becomes the main situation, then also the economy will inevitably suffer. So we call these cycles of violence, of conflict, that it has become more and more difficult to break out from. So the main message here is that none of these crises that we have seen in the world and that we're seeing today have only one dimension of driver. It's always a connection of economic, political, and social factors, right? All of them have been causes and consequences of conflict and often remained unaddressed after an escalation into violence. I've listed here in the circle some of the elements, factors that you find in most fragile situations. So we have a government that is weak, or actually that is quite strong, but not legitimate. It serves only parts of the population. It's a very important recognition for policymakers that instability doesn't mean weak governments, weak leaders. It actually often means very strong autocratic governments that cater for parts of the population and not for others. We could start a discussion about to what extent that was the case of the al-Bashir regime that was collaborating a lot with the West, for instance, because it was seen as a strong leader. It was seen as also a government that, to some extent could stop migration, for instance. And I'm not saying that, the former regime would be totally included in the international community. It wasn't. But it is important to recognize it takes more than a strong government to avoid fragility and conflict.
Can you push
Move it a bit.
move the mouse maybe?
Yes. Yeah. Society fragility, if there's tensions between different groups, often driven by politics, right? And groups that define your identity, either because of your ethnicity, because of your religion, or because of political orientation. If already these tensions are there, again, maybe as a consequence of dictatorship, then the society will take time to recover and create strong linkages. I could go around the circle, but I think most of them are rather familiar. The main message is just that, again, the political, social, and economic factors, they're often connected when conflict erupts. There's hardly a conflict that would come from only one dimension. This is why nowadays it makes more sense to not speak of just conflict, which we see when it erupts, when violence is there, open conflict, but to speak about fragility and try to understand what makes a society fragile. And then the definition that we're using, and again, you might think words, don't matter too much. They do, because they influence how policies are made, how programs are being, shaped, and how funds are being allocated, both for development cooperation, but also for investors, right? So fragility is when there's a combination of economic, political, and social factors that actually make it very hard for a system to deal with stresses, with crises. Be it a financial crisis, if already there is societal divisions, if already government is seen as someone who neglects an entire region or only favors people who vote for a certain party, then, an increase in prices can become just a little drop it needed for revolution to start, right? So it is helpful to think in terms of fragility rather than open conflict, because then the understanding is there that unless fragility is addressed, conflict can erupt at any time. And peace does not mean absence of conflict or fighting. Peace means that the fragility is being worked on so that more trust is built, more legitimacy is built, in order to enable that society to deal with stresses that will always come. If you have any questions or also, you want to challenge, please come in any time. Yes?
Peace also
I think maybe you use this one.
Thank you. Can't peace also be seen as ignorance to an extent, or just oblivious to the issue at hand, rather than actually communicating the problems? Peace can be some form of an illusion, rather than actually focusing on the issue.
For the ignorance. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. What is your name?
Hiba.
Hiba. Thanks, Hiba. Good, excellent question. Actually, you're jumping to my final slide, which is a cat. I don't know if you like cats. In Europe, people love cats. They have rather cats than kids. I have 4 kids and no cat, but I sometimes understand why they prefer cats. When cats are animals that when you ignore them, they come to you. When you call them, they will ignore you, right? But when you ignore them, they will come to you. And in one of my courses, the participants came up with this and said, conflict is really like a cat. If you ignore it, like you just said, because things are fine, right? We have a peace agreement. I mean, the Juba peace agreement was signed. Al-Hilu is talking. We're fine. We're not. If we don't create platforms where we bring out the challenges, where we discuss, the sensitive issues, secularism, religion, do we have racism in Sudan? If these are being ignored, they will catch up. They will catch us later, right? So you are absolutely right. Fragility, in a way, this concept is meant to address this ignorance. Because ignorance is easy when you define conflict just as open fighting, right, as violence. But when you recognize that it is fragility that needs to be addressed, it's harder to close your eyes and say, well, fragility is about social disparity. Yeah, we have that, It's about a government that doesn't cater for all the regions and all the ethnic groups. Yeah. So, yes, I think your way of capturing it is spot on. Thanks, Hiba. Let me just put them all up. I want to share a couple of, again, findings to show why there is more attention now for fragility. Anyone who cares about fighting poverty will see that up to 50% in now and 2/3 by 2030 of world's extreme poor will live in fragile situations. So if poverty is going to shrink in a meaningful way, it needs to happen in these difficult places. There's no way for development organizations or investors to say, no, that's not a market we're interested in. But in a different way also, for investors, it becomes more and more difficult to ignore emerging markets because this is where the opportunities are, right? So that's a different way of looking at it. It's also very clear that fragility is the main obstacle in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. There is, enough research on this. It is also very sad to see that most conflicts nowadays are recurrent conflicts. They have, come to an end, were post-conflict situations and then turned again into open violence. So in a way, that is a clear indication that approaches have failed to help these societies to recover and become resilient. It is also, there's enough research from the business community that it is fragility, so not just open fighting, that of course damages my operations as a business, but the constant mistrust between different community groups, the mistrust from private sector towards the government, the perception of certain groups that they've been neglected and disadvantaged all the time, even if it is not the case, and you as a business, you give equal opportunities, etc., that perception is there. And if you don't have a very sensitive communication strategy, you will be blamed for, again, favoring one group over the other. Hence, if you don't address these issues, your business will not flourish. And that is the good scenario. The very realistic scenario is that your business will do harm, will make the community even more fragile, will create more tensions, and ultimately might be seen as, an enemy to the community or an ally of a powerful party or a mayor that is in charge, right? So more and more we see literature from the business community itself, and I'll refer to it later, saying, guys, we cannot say we are apolitical. Yes, we are. We want to be apolitical, nothing to do with politics. However, if we don't understand also the political incentives that are out there, we will certainly, or the chances are really high, will be manipulated and used for somebody else's political interest. And lastly, maybe also what has become very clear in research is that economic factors matter a lot for reconstruction, and they, in typical post-conflict situations, in typical post-conflict situations, a lot of focus was on the humanitarian side and on peace building, right? A lot of working with the government, civil society in particular, and private sector was neglected until recently. The conception has often been, both from the development side and the private sector side, okay, a minimum of stability is needed, and then we can have the first movers, so to say. So IFC would be proud of being the first international agency moving into South Sudan and setting up the first lift in a hotel, for instance. That was their first big investment. But by now, there is more and more documented information about the fact that if you don't start with economic opportunities, and worse, if you start by distorting a market that is still very weak, but it's there, someone is providing goods and services. So if by distributing goods and, bringing in your for free services and having your food for work and cash for work programs, you're actually destroying a market that is just trying to, get back on its feet again. And so by this focus on the humanitarian side and more the softer peace building and delaying economic promotion and facilitating doing business, economic recovery was not just delayed, but made impossible. And myself, I found it so sad when I worked in Darfur 15 years ago, and there was a lot of humanitarian work. And comparing it to where Darfur stands now, I can see that damage, right? We've seen the dependency on aid that goes so deep into a certain mentality that people have been educated towards just asking for handouts, which does really something to your dignity. Right? Because it's not just that you want to have a job to feed your family. You want a job because you want to contribute to your society. You want to shape that system that is to grow resilient to stresses. Right? So I think these are important learnings that by now I think you cannot refute. They're well documented. So the response to that is, yes, we need more doing business, not when everything is safe and when everyone is fed, No, but from the start, from the very start, and maybe even while people are still fighting, right? If we want to wait until Darfur has no more fighting and no more attacks, again, we'll let Darfur down. Now, let's become a little bit more specific. When we say that economic factors matter in fragility becoming, again, open conflict, what are the economic factors really, right? So we've seen economic decline. We see economic decline even right now in Sudan, for instance. And there is more poverty now in Sudan than a year ago and 2 years ago. Is that a driver of conflict? The important answer is it never is, unless it is connected to some other issues. For instance, but remember that, right? So poverty, increasing poverty in itself has never proven to be a main driver of conflict. But whenever it relates to horizontal inequality, then it becomes a very strong factor for escalating conflict. What is horizontal inequality? It means that if you and I were both poor, it's fine. We will not turn around and blame anyone for it. But if you belong to a certain religious group and I belong to another religious group, and my community all of a sudden is getting poorer or better, actually doesn't matter. That's why poverty is not the main issue. So if your income level, if your poverty status changes according to your ethnic or religious or regional or political or sexual identity, this is a main driver for conflict, right? And again, beautifully here, maybe you don't care as much about research as I do, but it's one of the few very clear indicators that have been well documented. When changes in poverty, can be economic decline or economic progress, coincides with different social identities, it becomes a very strong conflict driver. Dependency on primary commodities, we've seen this also with oil a lot in this region. Yes, can be a driver for conflict, often has. Governments have failed to diversify early on. A lot of, expectations were there. And then in the worst case scenario, like in Sudan, if your main oil resources decide to belong to a different country, then you're in real trouble. So again, here this has often become, especially in the African continent, a driver of conflict. However, especially also when it relates to this other factor. So we had the mines earlier on, remember? This is also one sector, and they are very localized. Now, if you have dependency on primary resources, and they are located in regions that have been neglected for a long time, and then the sector doesn't receive the support it would deserve in order for labor to be safe, the work hazards to be less, then that can easily also escalate. So it doesn't just need to be a shutdown on oil, like in the case of Sudan, but it can also be strong dependence on certain mining resources, bad working conditions, and then coinciding with a region that has been neglected for a long time, right? And then the last one I want to mention also because it's so powerful in policy making, youth unemployment, and especially male youth unemployment, has been seen as a main driver. And especially after the Arab Spring, a lot of studies showed, and the World Bank was very engaged in saying, see, these young men, when they don't have a job, they immediately take up arms. Now, this one is the weakest from all of them, and that's why I put them last. There's no evidence of that at all. What is clear is that when there is, and actually the most powerful numbers came from Palestine at the time, that when you are unemployed and you also have absolutely no political participation, then your unemployment will just reinforce that feeling of negligence and total marginalization. And you become much more interested in radical ideology. That is something that has been well documented. And whether these people then join movements or take up arms, that is the next step that is less well followed so far. What I can tell you for sure is that employment doesn't decrease conflict. It has never done that. There's not a single study that would document that more employment for young men would bring down the potential propensity of conflict. Right, now, linking it back here to the context, there's different challenge funds lined up and, one ongoing. There will be more. And all, if you look at the requirements, they all say we need a lot of employment being created for the youth. The underlying assumption and theory of change, as donors often call it, is this, right? And it is also, if we give these people jobs, surely they will never travel all the way to Europe. We have now a lot of studies that document the opposite is true, right? And I lately spoke to someone from CTC who was telling the story of 2 university graduates from Khartoum who joined the company, were doing really well. That was a couple of years back, before the revolution. And after summer holiday, they wouldn't come back. And occasionally they would call and say, well, boss, I really like you, and I'm so sorry, but we managed. We went all the way through Libya, across the sea, and now we're here in kind of a camp. Doesn't look so nice after all, but. So then you realize that it is not those who don't have any job, no income, nothing. It is often an income that enables people to actually engage on, a life-risking journey. And people will do that in spite of a job that is promising, that has a career path. Because outside of your job, you're not a citizen that is appreciated, right? So this is where the political factors come in. So whenever you write your applications for a challenge fund, I would challenge your donors and say, and by the way, we'll not just create jobs, but these jobs are meant to be for different groups, being open for, groups across the conflict lines. And surely we will also try to open up and find channels to have these people engage in the broader society, and maybe do some more, rights awareness so that they can engage. The job will help them to engage as full-fledged citizens, not just as qualified laborers. And I'm sure you won the proposal, by the way. So this was all about, fragility. And before we move to the next question, I want to ask you, what is missing in the equation here? What do you think? We had a nice remark about ignorance. When you think about fragility and conflict, is there something that did not come up and in your experience, is very relevant to understand the concept or the reality? Freedom? Very good, excellent, yeah. I should edit right here. The freedom would be exactly under, what I tried to say in terms of a citizen.
Unemployment, you say, cannot lie.
Let me give you this. Yes.
Yeah, the last part,
Yeah.
you said the high unemployment, it cannot be like a fragility, but if we said, let's say, for example, all the men have job, but they don't have freedom to enjoy their life, so they'll travel to find their enjoyment outside. So they'll be looking for freedom.
Excellent. I like this very much. Now, if the topic here is doing business, where do you create freedom when doing business?
Okay. Freedom, maybe we can call it a part of businesses, but it's also related to government issue. So it's linked. Yeah.
Very good, yes. Thanks. You're bringing in both perspective, right? The government is there to create an enabling environment so that everyone is free to engage. And free not in the passive sense of you're not going to be shot if you open a business, but free in the sense that no matter from where you are, from which ethnic group, from which region, gender, right, you can do business in Sudan. So it's a freedom that requires certain support to have a starting position, right, that is giving equal opportunities to all. Yes. Very good. And then as a business, if you are owning a business, you're hiring people, you're choosing your supply chains, where is it that you create space, freedom, or where you create protection for people to, articulate themselves and their opinion and maybe challenge you as the boss of your firm. Could you think of anything?
Maybe it depends on qualifications.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on qualifications. It's like, I need, to success in our company, or we need to move on. That's why we need to depend on the qualification. No matter we're going to look for where come from where, or from ethnic side or something like that.
Yes, very good. So it relates to equal opportunities again, isn't it? And it relates to justice, to name another, important slogan of the revolution, and something that comes up. Yes, so the fairness of creating opportunities to advance in the company and learn, but also fairness in recruiting based on qualifications rather than the connections, right? Yes. Yes.
What if the business helped so many people to generate income, and then I cannot, as a business, as a private sector, protect them, which might trigger other group to attack them. So would also empowering people doing the business also could be a way to bring risks on them, because they have money but they don't have the protection, they're not strong, they don't have arms, and then other will come to them and steal from them, kill them, or whatever.
What do you think? Is that a real risk?
Yeah, it's a part of
Right?
security issue.
Yes.
Yeah, it's part of security issue. Yeah.
Very interesting. So this, now we're coming to the link of freedom is great, but it increases the risks actually. Increasing exposure means increasing vulnerability, and then the risk of no longer being secure or not providing security. True, yes, and that makes it tricky to create freedom. So let's see, we move to the interaction now between your operation as a program or as a business and this context, where we'll go through these different channels, including justice and freedom also. So how do our operations, whether it's a business or a program, interact with fragility? I didn't do a good job now in illustrating the logic. We want to move to a logic that is actually interdepending, right? So we have a context that is not just business, it's also having social and political aspects. And then I have a business, I want to produce and sell markoob, and that's it. I'm not interested in politics. I'm not supposed, it's not my job to, create linkages between these communities. It's hard enough, with the economic conditions to do my business. Now, the urgency is there to understand that if I don't look out and if I'm ignorant, I will miss to see that there is a lot of factors that will affect my business. I cannot avoid them. If I ignore them, they will hit me hard. So the idea is first to understand how is this fragility with its political, socioeconomic, or economic, social, and political factors, how is it actually affecting my business, right, or my program? And here, I've listed the most common ones. When it is a poor context already, unemployment is extremely high, but because of war or mismanagement, people are poorly educated. Maybe there's been displacement already, so there's shortage of labor. Even for places where there's high unemployment, we find many sectors where there's shortage of labor. And there is also situations, I think Ethiopia is a point in case where there was already a lot of unrest within the different unions among the laborers before investors came in, and so a lot of grievances had to be addressed from the start. High level of inequality is another one I want to pick. So you're operating in an environment where you have really big discrepancy of incomes, and where they actually do relate to identity groups. In Sudan, we see a lot of focus on the center, right, where more education has been taken place, also better health services, etc. So people are simply often in a better shape. Cities have been providing better services in urban areas. That's also something. And if you want to engage with that inequality that has been grown over decades, you need to define really carefully, A, how much can I do as a business person? B, if I want to engage and provide, literacy programs or at least trainings for my staff that is not having the exact skill set, Do I actually then communicate clearly who will get a chance and who am I providing this for? Do I create quota system for people coming from, a different location for women? These are all important questions that matter when you realize that because of a lot of inequality and grievances, your business will need to prove that it is carefully considering operations to not increase those challenges. We've discussed on the political, social dimensions, regional tensions, and perceived discrimination. I think that's the most important one, to see that even if you as a company try to be really aware and be fair, it might be that there's so much grievance already that you'll always be perceived because of your color, because of your background and your family, of someone who's favoring certain groups. And I think quota have never been very successful in companies or other institutions even, but strong communication strategies are the key here. To always explain why you choose a certain way of recruitment, why you choose certain selection criteria, right? Governance and justice was a big topic that came up earlier. I think corruption is in many fragile societies endemic, and it is not just a corruption of payment. It is a lot of corruption around politics, right? That people who get access to jobs or who got access to a good school or university were coming from families who were loyal, politically speaking, right? And this is less obvious, and some people would not call it corruption, but it is political corruption. And if that has become a way of doing things, both in the political sphere, but also in the business world, then it's really hard to, implement fairer or more just, to use the same terminology, ways of doing business. Why? Because those who've been suffering from the previous way of doing things will be happy. However, those who have slightly more power are not going to be happy, because before you didn't even need to do your best and work hard to get access to a job or to get, your licenses done, because your dad was well connected, or because you knew someone in his ministry. So again, with all the good attention as a business, wanting to get things right, you might have these people around in your direct, neighborhood or the ecosystem who will try to make you fail. At least not ignoring that and knowing them, understand where they come from, is the only way to enable you to maybe find ways to create other incentives for these spoilers, as we call them, to be fine with the new way of doing things, to also see some advantages for them in fair competition. Lastly, security. I think here I would like to just highlight that, yes, insecurity affects my business directly, right? Now, in the other way around, if I want to positively influence the security arrangements, I need to be careful in understanding, who benefits in my sector from certain security arrangements. How are the security arrangements being financed? How does the security sector in Sudan, with its military, with its secret services, with the RSF, with the paramilitias, how are they being financed? Surely they have nothing to do with the formal economy, right? Because that is, well, no, they dominate the economy, right? And is that the same for all the sectors? It isn't. No, there are certain sectors that are really, really affected a lot. And there's few people who, understand fully. There is almost, I think, every Sudanese knows that and knows some names, but it is not something that is, becomes apparent when you read the rules and regulations and when you study the investment law, and then everything looks fine. But in reality, there is monopolies, and there is still the same power connections that will make it much harder for you as a business or as a program that supports businesses to engage in real meaningful reforms. Because the reforms that stay on paper are totally irrelevant. Right? All right, so maybe time for some stories. And I'm sure there's lots of stories in the room. So I want to ask you, and I'll tell one story to then give you time to think about yours. In your operation, whether it is a business operation or whether it is a program or research, what is a situation that you have encountered where with all the good intentions, your operation has actually caused harm, has made things worse? And I'm not saying that your operation has caused a war or open fighting, but now that we've talked about, mistrust, social frictions, government legitimacy, all these elements, that can help conflict to move to less fragile societies, to what extent have your operations deteriorated a trust relationship or legitimacy of the government or grievances between groups? Okay? That's the task. When have I made things worse? So, and I will tell you maybe 2 stories about decent work in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, sometime back, still under Meles Zenawi, was a donor darling. Up to this day, it has its ambition to soon become a middle-income country, right? Very ambitious economic reforms took place, and a lot of investment came into the country. A lot of employment was created, especially for women. So you can imagine donors very happy because that's what will help a society to move forward. And it's true that women spend their money more wisely than men. I hope you're all aware of that. But in Ethiopia, big industries came in, especially in flour, coffee, tea, right? And different organizations helped the workers to organize, because that was the moment to also create some consciousness around labor rights. So we're moving into the justice side, but all within your workspace. Right? Now, at the time, the government, that was quite capable, Ethiopia, but quite capable, engaged with the different programs, invited the investors, created a very smooth entry for many foreign investors. A lot of joint ventures were created, foreigners together with Ethiopians, and growing businesses created. Now, it turns out that in the way of organizing laborers, with all the good intentions again, this move was used by the leading party at the time, the PRDF, to make sure that no one who has a leading role in the labor unions has any, interest in the opposition. So the labor unions that officially were there to defend the workers' rights and thereby then improve their productivity and effectiveness, etc., were actually also used to supervise and ensure that there's total political loyalty towards the leading party. And how did this happen? At the surface, things looked fine. Are they organized? Yes. How many do you have? 10,000 workers, in this area. Fantastic. How many women? Great. All youth? Super, I spoke to many of these women who were just doing the job for a couple of years to be able to leave to the Gulf and work as a maid, So their rights still were infringed. And what the labor unions did, helping to organize, was not really for them to then grow from their rights as laborers to maybe the next step, which is their rights as citizen, which is, by the way, exactly what happened during the industrialization in Europe, right? The industrialization in Europe brought more democracy because the workers said at one point, well, wait, what we're doing here in the factories, we can also do it in the streets. We can organize, right? We have power just because we're so many, not because we're rich. Well, in Ethiopia, really the government wanted to avoid this from happening. So when the unions organized, the political elite thought that's great. That makes it easier to actually supervise their political loyalty. And so the unions basically just served to keep a government in power, to silence the opposition, because there was a reporting system. So as soon as there was a worker who would talk, about politics during working hours, etc., this worker would disappear because unfortunately the harvest isn't that great this year, right? With all the economic justifications. Which I believe has played a tremendous role to keep a very exclusionary government in place for very long. Immediately, so what's the alternative then? What do I do? And I think one step forward is to reckon first that these guys are still the same and they hold monopoly. Right now, I don't have the luxury to, go to outside of the country or wherever to source. but I can start communicating and questioning. And I can also start looking into supporting growing entities that are there, right? That do see that there is a lack to diversity, for instance. And then once there is an alternative, pose the question, am I ready to pay the additional amount it takes to source from the newcomer in that supplier, system? We can't produce. This is just destroying our business. And they made it, rather than saying, let's not talk about politics or the conflict, because then we'll be seen as conflict actors. But they took that risk, talking about freedom. So they went out and said, we have stakes in this because we're losing our business. And they were perceived as pretty newcomer in that whole scene of political struggle. And it was very successful. And they were then, invited into a peace process, etc. And rather than saying, okay, now we've solved this issue, let's just focus on the business again, they then said, well, if that whole business was driven along ethnic lines, why don't we use our business, the different business member organizations, so some of them are chambers, some of them were councils, why don't we use them to consistently try and promote ethnic diversity in our member companies, in our own, right? So this is very attractive. And the question is, how is that perceived? How is it affected? And how is it then again impacted by a fragile context? Thank you very much. With all the dimensions we discussed. And I think a helpful way for you when doing your business and suffering from the many challenges is to go through these impact channels, I call them. Many people will have something to lose from different groups. And these are like more abstract examples maybe, but in Mexico and Indonesia, at a time where entire regions were run by warlords and no investors would ever go in there, there's been examples of companies breaking good deals or brokering good deals and going on purpose in these regions and sitting with the warlord and saying, look, if this works, it provides employment and some of your people will get employment, but we'll also bring in people from elsewhere, and it will provide services that haven't been around for some time, and it will give your region a whole different standing, a reputation. And these are all crumbles of your chocolate cake that one can use to create incentives in really difficult environments where maybe even humanitarian programs would fail, but where a private investment can make a whole difference. Okay. So to close that second point, in order to come with good answers to the question of how do operations interact with fragility, here are some ways of breaking the question down. And again, it's not about learning the answers, it's about you asking these questions. Not just ask who do I need to hire to do the job, but also say like, who will hence never have a chance to get a job in my company, right? How am I selecting my suppliers? Do I really don't have a choice? Or do I do another market assessment and see if there's a new supplier who's just set up shop, who's still more expensive, but I'm willing to consider shifting. How often are you going to reassess the market? How do you advertise, the need for certain fabrics, supplies, whatever? Have you really, found all the ways of giving this new supplier a chance to access your market by selling to you? I think these are just questions to ask yourself to find the right timing to then shift more towards building that new playing field, right, of doing business in a way that is fair, doesn't finance security actors, and gives a chance to newcomers also who offer higher quality at lower price, but who really, have come all that way by their own merits and means. So I don't want to read down these questions. It's rephrasing a bit what I just said. But I, again, want to give you the floor maybe and see if there's other questions. Now, you've listened very nicely to these ideas. Any other questions that you would ask yourself or, your business partner? when you think about these elements of justice and of legitimacy, governance that come to mind? And maybe you can think of it like, and I did not include that slide, but of course it makes sense to think of a business that has direct employees, and the next layer would be the suppliers you're buying from, right, or retailers. And then the next level could be your broader customer circle and the community that you also serve as a social enterprise, but as any enterprise that delivers a product or service, right? And then there is the entire ecosystem of which you're also part. It's easiest to look at your direct environment, but surely the biggest impact for you from a fragile environment comes from the broader ecosystem. We've spoken about insecurity, government actions that are maybe not creating equal chances to everyone. So you get some exercise to do. Let's just move on to this so we don't put you too much on the spot. I want to highlight a couple of publications that are there that I really recommend. This one is a nice one of business leaders done by the Swedish Council, and it just collects a number of experiences from big corporates and their leaders about why it matters to understand complexity. So they don't speak about fragility and conflict because that destroys the investment in the first place, right? It's really the jargon that development cooperation brings in. For business people, it's emerging markets. Sometimes they call them high-risk markets, but also complex markets, right? And they clearly say it's not a nice ads-on. It's not window dressing or PR to say, oh, I care about this ethnic conflict in my region. No, it's really about securing your staff and assets, and then also make sure that your company is not damaging the community relationship you've built, your social license to operate, right? Which is so I'm not talking about charity here. I'm talking about people who just want to run a business. They've invested in it. You have invested in businesses, and you don't want to lose them. So all of this is pretty self-interested. The difference is short and long term. Do you make the effort to think longer term? Do you buy from the military today because that's how you can survive today? But at the same time, by financing the security, you are undermining your longer term prospect as a company. And that applies to everyone here in the room. It's just a wonderful example you're giving. And it applies to every development program as well, right? Because we need to achieve targets in 3 years, maybe 4 years, whatever the classical duration of a program is. So yeah, if we created jobs by fueling tensions, no one will blame us because the tensions will only explode after 6 or 10 years. So it's an interesting publication that you can find online and that gives you very concrete cases. It's about big corporates, but at the same time, often they have companies in several places, so a good comparison. That brings us then to this last question before you can work in groups, and it's about, so how do we mainstream conflict sensitivity into our operations? And we've already talked about it. It really requires not just assessing the market, but assessing what we call the political economy of that market. So if I'm in, again, marcoup production, who's producing these marcoups? Who's benefiting from the business and who's not benefiting from the business, right? If I want to have marcoup growing as a sector, is there other sectors who are selling Chinese sandals, for instance, who will suffer from my success? If they do, so what is my communication strategy? How do I get them on board? How do I avoid them becoming the spoilers? And how do I hire? If I know that this is it's a craft that has been passed on from generation to generation, so a certain group has benefited from economic opportunities in the sector, is there any way I can bring in other groups as well? Right. That means then, in a nutshell, that if I want to mainstream conflict sensitivity, it's really about operational decisions. Operational decisions about the sector, the value chain, the region where I operate, and then not just ask for the economic potential and what is the most efficient, effective, and cheapest way of getting things done, but also what is the potential of creating more trust of connecting people that normally are not connected, right? And in addressing some of the grievances and creating that freedom and that space for people to feel they're valued, valued citizens in their community rather than just effective workers in my company. Right. I will not go into detail, but ask you we'll do some groups now, and I think it's high time to do that. I don't know what is the best way of splitting up. I think I would like to have mixed groups, so not those who are running business altogether, but those who are doing something else. And that we can have 3 groups, I think for the size here would be good, to work on these 3 questions, where they're not new questions, but are the ones we've been discussing. Now, you can either all decide to talk about one case you have in your group, and then answer the question of what is a concrete risk I'm seeing for my operations to create more tensions in the community, or address increase the mistrust, or actually undermine an emerging market that is there, or increase the mistrust towards the government and its legitimacy. And then secondly, what could I do as a researcher, a policymaker, or someone in the public sector or in business to actually address this, right? Through a communication strategy, a different hiring strategy. It can be different things. You can think about this. How do I design the process of this whole thing? And then thirdly, if I do this right and my mitigation strategy works out, so how might my business operation or my program actually help to build lasting peace? Okay, these are the questions. Think if you have any questions, and I think of how to divide the groups. All right. You will have 6 people per group, approximately. And I think I will just make the groups, and then we see if we have enough diversity. So this block here would be one group without you. You will join. You're joining, right? Yes. You're joining this group, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until you, but not you. Okay. You're group number 2. All right. And then we have this group here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you also are part of the 3rd group. Okay. I think then we have approximately the same size. Now I want to check, is there people here who are with a government or research institution or knowledge institute? No. University, or are you? You just graduated? Postgraduate. Okay. I like how you want to make this clear. And how about you? Undergraduates? Okay, good. Then we have, I know you guys, and you?
I'm running a business.
You're running a business. Wonderful. Okay, I like this. This is good in terms of their... Here, do we have people from doing business? I mean, are you...
No, we both have pretty much work at.
Maybe you have a side business.
Yeah.
I'm running a business.
Yes, you're running a business. Yeah. Very great. Good. And then we have?
Teacher also running a business.
Good. Ah, nice. Okay, that is enough diversity also to disrupt the group. And then here, do we have business people? Do we have people from the government, or you're also a business person, right? Or student? Perfect. Very good. Knowledge Institute. Student? Also student, right? Very good. Business. Yes.
My boss.
Ah, okay. I need to put you elsewhere. Yes. I will shift you. I will take you. Malish, we will swap. I need a volunteer. You. You are my volunteer. Go here. We don't need the same company in one group. Yes. I'm sure she will make good promotion and also bring in your Okay, great. Let's say you have 10 minutes for each question. 10 minutes for each question.
10 minutes?
Yes.
So, what concrete is this program? To do harm or accelerate?
There's a need for life.
Any?
There's a need for discussions.
See, I'm not experienced with that. Is there comments coming in or no? But and did Ines? Okay.
But I'm not thinking that's what.
No, then
That's
I
it?
think.
Okay. There's no. It's all about discussion right now.
Yes, exactly. So half an hour, nothing. Yes, thank you. Do I need to switch this off?